Say the word Mexico and ask someone what language is spoken there. You'll get one answer instantly with total confidence: Spanish. Here's the number that answer misses. Mexico government officially recognizes 68 living indigenous languages as national languages with equal legal status to Spanish, not dialects, not regional variations of Spanish. 68 separate languages, most of them older than Spanish has even existed in the Americas, some spoken by millions of people still alive today inside one of the most visited countries on Earth. And almost nobody outside Mexico, and frankly, plenty of people inside Mexico, could name more than one or two of them. And it gets stranger. Those 68 languages aren't 68 versions of one thing. They span 11 completely distinct language families. Families as different from each other as English is from Mandarin. Somewhere in Mexico right now, there are two people separated by a single mountain range who cannot understand a single word the other one is saying. And Spanish isn't the reason. Their languages were never related to begin with. Welcome to the Airlearn Language Show. Today, we're going into the linguistic map hiding underneath the one everyone assumes Mexico has, where these languages came from, why the Spanish conquest didn't erase them the way it did in so many other places, which ones are thriving, and which ones are down to their last handful of speakers, and why the Mexican government's own answer to this problem looks nothing like what most countries have tried. And if a story about a country holding on to 68 languages at once makes you want to actually pick up Spanish yourself, Airlearn teaches it contextually, the way it's really spoken across Latin America. Links in the description. Now, let's go back to before Spanish ever arrived. Before 1519, when Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of what would become Mexico, the region that now makes up the country was not linguistically simple. It was, and still is, one of the most linguistically diverse regions on Earth relative to its size, home to sophisticated civilizations, each with their own language, writing traditions, and literature, developed independently over thousands of years. The Aztec Empire, centered in the Valley of Mexico, ran its administration in Nahuatl, a language so dominant across central Mexico at the time that it functioned as a genuine lingua franca, spoken far beyond the Aztecs' own ethnic group, the way Latin once functioned across the Roman world. To the south, in the Yucatan Peninsula and Chiapas, Maya civilization had already produced one of the most advanced writing systems in the pre-Columbian Americas, recording history, astronomy, and religious life in a hieroglyphic script centuries before European contact. This wasn't a patchwork of dialects of one indigenous language. Linguists classify Mexico indigenous languages into 11 distinct language families, plus several isolates with no proven relatives at all, meaning the linguistic diversity inside modern Mexico's borders is structurally comparable to the diversity of an entire continent, not a single country. Here's the part of this story that makes Mexico genuinely unusual compared to most of the rest of the Americas. Spanish colonization was violent, and it was catastrophic for indigenous populations. Disease, forced labor, and conquest reduced populations dramatically within a few generations. And yet, indigenous languages in Mexico survived this in far greater numbers and in far greater diversity than in many other colonized regions of the hemisphere. Part of the explanation is sheer scale and density. Central and southern Mexico at the time of conquest had some of the largest and most densely settled indigenous populations anywhere in the Americas. Millions of peoples, organized into complex, established societies with deep-rooted linguistic and cultural institutions. Even catastrophic population loss couldn't erase languages spoken by that many people across that many independent communities simultaneously, the way smaller, more scattered populations elsewhere were more easily and completely displaced. Part of the explanation is also, ironically, colonial religious policy. Early Spanish missionaries, particularly Franciscan and Dominican friars tasked with converting indigenous populations to Catholicism, frequently found it more effective to learn and preach in indigenous languages rather than force instruction in Spanish from the onset. Nahuatl, in particular, was extensively documented, taught, and even used in early colonial administration, precisely because Spanish authorities found it practical to work through an existing language franca rather than replace it immediately. Entire catechisms, dictionaries, and grammars of Nahuatl and other indigenous languages were produced by Spanish clergy in the 1500s and 1600s, created for conversion purposes, but which had the side effect of formally documenting and, to some extent, prestige stamping these languages for centuries afterward. That said, none of this means indigenous languages in Mexico were simply left alone. Later colonial and post-independence policy, especially from the 19th century onward, shifted decisively toward Spanish-only nation building, with indigenous languages actively discouraged in schools and public life for generations, in patterns broadly similar to assimilation policies pursued elsewhere. The survival of Mexico's linguistic diversity isn't a story of benign neglect. It's a story of resilience against real sustained pressure, aided by initial colonial era accident of scale and missionary pragmatism that gave these languages a documented head start most other indigenous languages in the Americas never got. According to Mexico's National Institute of Indigenous Languages, INALI, the government's official count is 68 living indigenous language groupings, which further break down into 364 documented linguistic variants, meaning many of those 68 languages are themselves umbrella categories containing multiple distinct, sometimes mutually unintelligible dialects. The scale of individual languages varies enormously. Nahuatl remains one of the most widely spoken indigenous languages in the country, with well over 1 million speakers spread across multiple states, still functioning as a living, everyday language in many communities, not merely a ceremonial or historic one. Yucatec Maya, spoken primarily in the Yucatan Peninsula, has close to 1 million speakers and remains a genuinely dominant daily language in significant parts of that region. Zapotec and Mixtec, both spoken primarily in Oaxaca, each have several 100,000 speakers, though importantly, both are actually clusters of multiple distinct variants, some different enough from each other that speakers from different Zapotec-speaking towns may struggle to fully understand one another. At the other end of the scale, some of Mexico's 68 recognized languages are down to a genuine critical number of speakers, in some cases fewer than 100, or even a handful of extreme cases, fewer than 10 remaining fluent speakers, placing them in the same urgent endangered category as languages like Ainu in Japan or many Native American languages in the United States. Roughly 6 to 7% of Mexico's total population, around 7 million people, speak an indigenous language today, according to the recent census figures, and a meaningful share of that population is monolingual or more comfortable in their indigenous language than in Spanish, particularly in older generations in more isolated rural communities. Mexico's approach to this diversity is genuinely distinctive and worth understanding in some detail, not because it's simply symbolic. In 2003, Mexico passed the General Law of Linguistic Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which formally declared that Spanish and all 68 recognized indigenous languages have equal legal status as national languages. This isn't just a ceremonial declaration. The law establishes real rights, including the right to receive government services, healthcare, and justice system access in one's own indigenous language, and the right to bilingual, intercultural education for indigenous communities. In practice, implementation is uneven, and this is an important caveat. A law declaring 68 languages officially equal to Spanish doesn't instantly produce court interpreters, government forms, or trained bilingual teachers in all 68 languages. In every region where they're needed, and indigenous rights organizations within Mexico have repeatedly pointed out significant gaps between the law-stated protections and the actual on-the-ground resources available, particularly in the country's poorer, more rural, and more heavily indigenous southern states, like Oaxaca and Chiapas. But the legal framework itself represents a genuinely different approach than most countries take. Rather than treating indigenous languages as a heritage or minority rights issue separate from the real national language, Mexico's law formally places 68 indigenous languages in the same official category as Spanish itself, a national language, not a national language plus 68 footnotes. Part of why this fact is so consistently surprising to people outside Mexico, and frankly, to plenty of Mexicans in Spanish-dominated urban areas, comes down to visibility and geography. Mexico's indigenous language-speaking population is heavily concentrated in specific states, particularly Oaxaca, Chiapas, Yucatan, and Guerrero, rather than evenly distributed across the country. Major cities like Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey, the places most tourists, business people, and media coverage actually engage with, function overwhelmingly in Spanish. It's entirely possible to visit Mexico extensively, consume Mexican film, food, and music, and never encounter a word of Nahuatl, Zapotec, or Maya simply because the country's linguistic diversity is real, but geographically concentrated, much like Portuguese-speaking Africa's growth being invisible to people only paying attention to Brazil and Portugal. There's also a longer historical pattern of Mexican national identity, like many post-colonial nations, being built around a unifying narrative: one country, one national language, one mestizo cultural identity that makes indigenous linguistic diversity feel, for much of the 20th century, like a regional or historic footnote rather than a defining national feature, despite the numbers actually involved. So, here's what actually sits underneath the simple answer: Mexico speaks Spanish. 68 living languages spanning 11 distinct language families, some spoken by over 1 million people as a genuine daily language, some down to a simple digits of remaining fluent speakers, all formally recognized as having equal legal status to Spanish since 2003, and virtually invisible to anyone whose experience of Mexico is limited to its Spanish-dominant cities. Nahuatl gave the world words most people use without a second thought: chocolate, tomato, avocado, coyote, all Nahuatl in origin, filtered through Spanish and then English. Yucatec Maya is still, right now, the everyday language of daily life in significant parts of the Yucatan. And in a handful of communities scattered across Oaxaca and Chiapas, some of the last living speakers of specific Zapotec or Mixtec variants are quietly the only remaining link to a language that may not survive their own lifetime. Mexico didn't lose its indigenous languages the way so many colonized regions did. It kept 68 of them alive against real historical pressure, and then uniquely wrote that survival directly into law. The question now isn't whether Mexico has this diversity. It's whether the resources catch up to the legal promise before some of those 68 languages quietly run out of speakers to protect. If a story about a country holding 68 languages together at once makes you want to actually learn Spanish yourself, and maybe discover a bit of what's underneath it, Airlearn teaches it, contextually, the way it's really spoken. Links in the description. See you in the next one.